Hello, hello, and welcome back to the P2P Soap Box for our final episode of Season 2. I'm your host and P2P BFF, Marcy Maxwell, and I am so happy to wrap up this season with another great topic. This season has been a fun one, covering everything from building stronger partnerships with our marketing teams, building a better case for DIY fundraising, and digging into lots of data. I am so grateful to all the guests who joined us over the past few months, and for all of you who have tuned in every other week. Season 3 will be back in late summer, which will be here before we know it. So now on to today's episode. Long before nonprofit organizations had local offices and national program teams, what we now call peer-to-peer fundraising events were born through the hard work of dedicated volunteer leaders passionate about raising money for causes they loved in their communities. Now, as our employee ranks have grown, volunteer management has remained a critical strategy for our event success, but it often feels like an elusive one, falling to the back burner behind sexier marketing and digital strategies. Identifying the right people, placing them in the right roles, empowering them to make decisions, and holding them accountable, all of this can be challenging and time-consuming. And as a result, it often feels easier to simply handle the work ourselves. However, it is that mindset that both burns out our staff and limits our potential to expand our reach and influence within the communities. I am so glad to be joined today by Bryan Sherwood, Senior Director for Relay for Life at the American Cancer Society. More than just a fundraising walk, the American Cancer Society Relay for Life, since 1985, has brought together passionate supporters who embody the organization's vision to end cancer as we know it for everyone. Relay for Life has been a long-standing member of the P2P Top 30 and ranked as number 6 in the 2023 U.S. study. Bryan has a unique professional background, having started his career in the world of IT customer service, but it was his volunteer work with Relay for Life since a young age that led him to his current role as the national program lead. During our conversation, we'll explore how the Relay for Life volunteer experience and volunteer expectations have evolved over the years, particularly in this post-pandemic era. Bryan will share the key qualities his team looks for when identifying new volunteer leaders and some of the lessons learned from working with volunteers across different generations. We'll also dig into how to train your staff on critical volunteer management skills and how volunteers can play a pivotal role in expanding and diversifying your P2P portfolio. So let's jump right in to my conversation with the American Cancer Society's Bryan Sherwood. Bryan, welcome to the podcast. So happy to have you.
Hey, Marcy. Yeah, glad to be here. Very excited to be on the soapbox.
Absolutely. So, Bryan, we got to know each other a little bit through your speaking role at our recent conference, and you have a really unique journey to your role at the American Cancer Society. So can we just kind of start off, tell us a little bit about that personal and professional journey that led you to your role leading the Relay for Life program at the American Cancer Society?
Yeah, definitely. And it's definitely something I got asked about in follow-ups from my presentation at the conference. So happy to share. So I actually started as a volunteer, as a lot of folks do in the peer-to-peer space, I feel like. I started in middle school volunteering at Relay for Life, was involved throughout my high school and college days in different relay events. And then moved into some training and leadership roles that ACS had offered at the time, and still offers in a lot of places at a regional and divisional level. Ended up, one thing led to another, and I ended up being the national volunteer lead for Relay for Life. I started that role in January of 2020. So that was an interesting year. Yes, an interesting year to be the lead of a peer-to-peer program from even a volunteer perspective. At the same time, I was working in the IT field. So I was doing customer service management for IT organizations, and opportunity came up to move to the staff side at the American Cancer Society and, take those 17 years of volunteer experience and some of the leadership experience I gained both at ACS and in my, work life and lead Relay for Life, which was a little bit of a daunting ask, but was something I was really excited to take on. And now I'm here in a staff role leading one of our largest fundraisers in the country. So.
That's awesome. So there's a couple of things I want to unpack in that. So again, I think everybody listening is very familiar with the Relay for Life program, but maybe not with the volunteer structure. And I know that volunteer engagement, volunteer leadership has always been, kind of the signature strategy for that program. What does the volunteer experience look like, especially that national volunteer role? And since you mentioned COVID, how has that evolved even post-COVID?
Yeah, ACS and Relay for Life have been known, as you mentioned, for a long time for being driven by volunteers, and that nothing has changed in that regard. In fact, we've gotten even more focused on our volunteers in today's world. I think our national volunteers have benefited from the enhancements in video meeting and technology that we've had since kind of that were accelerated through COVID, and are really able to engage in a nationwide level and helping us set the strategy for Relay. So definitely that's something that's continued to evolve at post-COVID. I think for our volunteerism as a whole and our volunteer leaders experience, we're definitely seeing, as I think a lot of folks are, the trend towards volunteers wanting to be more episodic. Maybe they're less willing to commit a huge chunk of their time in advance. And so we've adapted to that in a lot of our local event roles, making sure that our staff feel empowered and our volunteer leaders feel empowered to make sure that they're offering volunteer opportunities that people are willing to say yes to, whether that's taking an actual leadership role or maybe taking on something smaller that doesn't have an official title in it, but is still giving back to Relay for Life and the American Cancer Society. So I think we've definitely evolved in some places, but the core of it is definitely still the same, in that we want our volunteers to have ownership of Relay in their communities. We want them to understand the impact that they're making on the American Cancer Society's mission. That part hasn't changed. We've maybe even just enhanced it post-COVID.
Yeah, it makes me think about like the gig economy, right? People wanting those
totally
small interactions beyond maybe a full-time opportunity. Can you just dig in a little bit more about, so what is this National Volunteer Committee? What do they do? That's not something a lot of programs have.
No, and it's sometimes it's a little scary, the power that we've put in some of these volunteers. But we have a robust structure of volunteers at both our regional level that come up generally from our events. They're generally folks that are top fundraisers for us, or maybe have taken event leadership roles at the local level, and they're really helping me set the strategy for Relay for Life, and our regional strategic directors as well. They're really partnered with us in that whole process. I mean, I sit on strategic planning calls with my volunteer partner, who is herself a longtime relayer, has been doing this for 30 years, is a retired accountant, and comes to us with lots of experience, both in the relay world and just in her career world, and can speak, from the volunteer lens in terms of what training we might need and what opportunities we might want to provide and how we engage our volunteers, to even some of our financials and how are we raising money, how are we performing compared to last year. It runs the gamut. And, she knows pretty much everything I know about the Relay program in terms of where we currently stand. And that's so helpful when I'm setting strategy. It's great to, be able to sit and think about your program strategy, but it's so much better to be able to sit with someone who gets it and understands it and can talk through the hard decisions and the prioritization that's there. So really our volunteers, both at that local level and all the way up to, the work that I'm doing at our national strategy, have been key and are something we continue to focus on.
I love that. I think that's, we always talk about volunteer moves management, just like you do donor moves management. It's a great opportunity to move them up the chain. But, it feels like, and what I feel like I hear from a lot of people is, tools like social media, it's made it even easier than ever to, support the cause you love, right? but it also creates a little bit of, the term slacktivism, right? So it
Yeah.
feels like it's gotten harder to get those really strong volunteers to take action, right? To accept that leadership position. So what do you find that your supporters are looking for in that volunteer leadership experience? And then really, like, what are you looking for in them? Like, what skills are you looking to bring for them to bring to the table?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's definitely easy to click a button in today's world, and maybe less easy to give away your time. And I think our volunteers, also value more of their time than they did prior to COVID as well. So it's become even harder. I think our volunteers are. I think about some of our most successful volunteers, and I think they're really looking for that ability to own something. So I think about our most successful Relay for Life event leads, for example, and it's why are they successful? Well, they're seen as the Relay for Life person in their community. They're seen as that leader within their community, and we all like a little bit of that, pat on the back and a position of authority, if you will, within your community, or even just a position where you're an influencer in your community. Maybe that's a better term. And I think our volunteers are looking for that. So I think about some of our new events that have come back, that are completely volunteer driven. They're coming back post COVID. We don't send a staff person there in the field. These are volunteers that are doing that grassroots work. And why, what are they looking for? They're looking for some way that their community can give back to the American Cancer Society's mission. And it's about finding that volunteer that truly values the ability to own that in their community, make it look like their community, and own the impact in their community. And from what we're looking for is some of the same things. We're looking for folks that are highly engaged, that are connected within their community, that care about our mission, to end cancer as we know it for everyone, and to help us deliver that mission through peer-to-peer fundraising events. We know it's not all about the fundraising. Deliver our mission and knowledge about our services into those communities that normally we would never be able to reach. So I think it's so much about that impact, ownership, and really just the relationshiping that we have with our volunteers.
Well, and what you mentioned that sometimes you're starting a new event and you're not even sending a staff partner into the mix. And I think that was the tried and true method for so many organizations, is partnering up that staff partner with the volunteer partner. I even think back on kind of my early career working with volunteer committees. I think when I first started, I was given a committee full of board members' wives. They might have been the most demanding and also the most amazing group of women I worked with early on, as this 23-year-old coming into the job. And I did not realize at the time how well I was trained by my bosses at the time on how to work with a volunteer leadership committee and work with these personalities and build that partnership, until I kind of moved on and got more into a training role and realized, wow, I was taught really well, and not everybody else has been. So that's obviously such an important skill set for the staff members that you do have, especially managing from afar. So how are you training your staff, especially remotely, to be volunteer managers and build these strong partnerships with the volunteer committees that are more of the boots on the ground?
Yeah, you're right. It's so critical. And when you're not there in person, and even sometimes not even over video, depending on how we're communicating with our volunteers, there's a lot that can be missed in just talking on the phone, for example, or sending a text or an email. But I think, we as an organization have prioritized trusting our volunteers, especially when it comes to the peer-to-peer space and our event committees and event leadership teams. And it's kind of ingrained in our training from the get-go. So when you onboard with the American Cancer Society, we're talking about that volunteer staff partnership from day one, whether you're in events or not in events. We know our volunteer partners are valuable even outside of our peer-to-peer work as well. But I think the staff that we have that are the most successful whether they're remote or in person, focus so heavily, and I'm going to go back to that R word of relationships. They've built relationships with those volunteers, whether that is, a text text message based relationship, or it is a something over Zoom or even over the phone. I think the we've really focused on giving them the tools to be able to build those relationships with their volunteers and make those relationships genuine as well. So I think, those are the pieces that we've really tried to train our staff on. We also, especially with our remote staff, try to make sure we're retaining staff, because it's a lot, as you mentioned, it's not always easy without doing it to have those skills. And so the longer we can retain our staff, the better our volunteer relationships continue to be. So I think those are kind of the focus areas we have there, in mostly around allowing the volunteers to own their event and also build those relationships.
Yeah, I hear you so much on the piece about trust, right?
Yeah.
Trusting that, this is your event and I'm just here to help you make it happen. I think I've shared this on a podcast before. I remember having an aha moment very early in my career, thinking, well, the volunteers are here to help me raise money, not I am here to help the volunteers raise money for the cause that they love. And that, switch being flipped, I think was really pivotal for me.
Yeah.
But, you mentioned with Relay, there's a lot of different audiences. So relays happen on college campuses, relays happen in communities all over the country. So your staff are working with very different volunteer groups, having somebody who's been a volunteer for 30 years and is a former accountant, as opposed to a junior in college who's a digital native Gen Z. That's a really different experience. So what have you learned from these groups? And, what are some of the best practices about working with the different audiences that you've found?
Yeah, you're totally right. It spans all age groups in terms of who we have engaged with ACS and with Relay for Life specifically. I think what we've started to see, especially as we've continued to empower our volunteers, even with a remote staffing model, is in our community work, those kind of generally, our audience there is generally older, of course, than our especially compared to our college and high school audience. But the audience is typically more wanting to do what they want to do. They have a little bit more empowerment to just say, I want to do it this way. They make the decision, they roll with it, no problem. Our college and youth audience doesn't necessarily feel the same way. They might have an opinion of what they want to do, but they might not know how to get there. And so they may need a little bit more of a firm direction of how do I accomplish this thing. And I think what's been interesting, especially as we've come out of COVID, is some of these students that we're working with didn't go to high school for 4 years in person. They might have gone to high school for 2 years virtually or 3 years virtually because of the pandemic. And so I think some of that impacts their ability to understand, how do I build an effective club on campus? How do I build an effective event on campus? And so we've really been starting to invest more into how can we give those students the tools they need to feel successful. Whereas with our communities, we've really leaned into, we want Relay to fit your community. You know what your community wants. You know what you want. Let's help you get there. Let's help you raise that money to continue your story there. But I think for our college audience and our youth audience, it's just a little bit different in what they're looking for in that group. And then, of course, the simple thing there of working with different age groups is, of course, just that communication difference. But I feel like a lot of that goes back to the trust and the relationships that are there. Of like, do you have the trust built with your volunteers to say, hey, would you rather me just call you? Or, hey, would you rather me just send this in an email? And I think if you don't have any relationship to fall back on, you consistently are going to run into challenges with communicating or challenges with understanding what that volunteer wants and how they want to be able to give back to the mission. So
it's so interesting to hear that the younger generation wants things a little bit more prescriptive, right? Because I think we would assume otherwise. I think we would assume, and in some ways, we talk about designing our programs, with this more of a DIY flair, because we've been told this generation wants to do it the way they want to do it, right? So it's interesting hearing your experience that they want like a task list for success.
Right. And they might want control, or they might want to decide what entertainment looks like at their event, what activities look like at their event. But they're craving some information on how to be successful. How do we fundraise? How do we actually execute a Relay for Life event? And so we're kind of having to build two different pieces here, because you're right. The general industry trend has been more DIY, more do it the way you want to do it, make it fit your community, make it fit your campus. But I think there's a balance there, especially with younger volunteers, to giving them the structure that they need to still be successful. So.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. Well, so Bryan, it's no secret that Relay for Life, used to be the absolute biggest fundraising event in our industry. But I know that ACS has made some strategic decisions over the past, probably say decade, to really diversify your revenue streams away from just Relay for Life. So how has the volunteer community and these volunteer networks that you've built, how have they been a part of helping you make that change?
Yeah, we've really done quite a bit of work to integrate our volunteers across our different programs, whether that be peer-to-peer or otherwise, and really help build that volunteer life cycle. I was actually listening to a previous episode of the podcast where I can't remember her name, but she's from the American Heart Association, was talking
Kim
about
Sloan.
Yes, she was fantastic. Was talking a little bit about just how they diversify so that they can have something for everyone. And I feel like we're definitely aligned in that same type of work. How we execute it might be a little different, but we want to have an event experience for every community and for every person. When we moved in 2020, when we made significant changes to our organization, like every nonprofit organization and probably every organization in the world did, we did centralize a lot of our work under what we call community fundraising, so that we're not just looking at Relay for Life, we're not just looking at making strides against breast cancer, but we're looking at our community fundraisers as a whole. And our volunteer leadership followed that. I was actually a volunteer at the time when we did that work. And really, we pulled together volunteers from all those different programs, leveraging what the American Cancer Society knew about building national volunteer teams that are strategic and impactful. And now we leverage that in making strides against breast cancer, in our endurance and determination events, even somewhat in some of our galas events as well there. And really, that trust that the organization built with volunteerism for so many years, I feel like we are now reaping the rewards of that across all of our programs. And we're building a volunteer community around that as well, where just because I'm a Relay for Life volunteer doesn't mean I'm not going to go support my friends at Making Strides Against Breast Cancer, for example. And so it benefits everyone. It allows our volunteers to more easily move between those programs too, I think. If you move to a market where maybe we don't have a Relay for Life event, but we have a Making Strides, or we participate in an endurance event in that community, it becomes very easy for you to re-engage with the American Cancer Society, because you've built a network of people that are engaged with ACS, regardless of whether it's Relay for Life or otherwise. So I'm proud of the work that we did there in what was a tough couple of years, both from our staff that were working there at the time, myself as a volunteer at the time, to really infuse that volunteerism that we built through Relay for Life over all of those years into our other programs of work at ACS. And it's an ongoing process. It's not perfect on day one to be able to do that, but we were able to leverage a lot of folks who knew how to do that to maybe move a little bit more quickly than just standing up a brand new national volunteer structure, for example. So.
Well, Bryan, I know that there are probably people listening who are thinking, engaging volunteers is our biggest challenge right now. What advice would you have from both being a volunteer for so many years and sitting in your national role? What advice would you have for those people who feel like this is the biggest obstacle for their programs?
I think, not to harp on my relationship word, which I feel like has been the buzzword of this podcast episode, but I think focusing on the relationships, and really, if you're looking at a pool of 100 volunteers that some of, but maybe don't know all of, or know a little bit about all of them, like, what are those highest impact relationships that you can pursue out of that volunteer pool? I think it's always better to build a volunteer pool with another volunteer. And so if you can build that first 1 or 2 or 3 relationships where you can leverage, what that person is good at and what they bring to the table, it all of a sudden becomes easier to engage your volunteers because you're not doing it just as a staff person that works for an organization. You're doing it in collaboration with your volunteer. I mean, it makes everything easier from making an ask to having tough conversations. I mean, I never go into tough conversations with volunteers without another volunteer of some kind with me in those conversations that I trust. And so I think being able to build those initial few key relationships where you can then leverage volunteers to continue to build your engagement strategy and really execute your engagement strategy is a good first step. And if you're not there at all yet, I think going out and defining what it is you're looking for is helpful too. I mean, we do that a lot of we have this pool of volunteers, they're not effective. Okay, well, what are we missing? What are we actually asking them to do? So if you're not even at the point where you have a pool to look at, I think defining what it is you're targeting is maybe the first key step, and then building those relationships so you can build that wave of volunteerism within your organization.
I love that. And I think it goes back to also what you said about trust, because I think sometimes organizations want to kind of protect an image, right? To their volunteers. They don't want them ever to think anything is wrong, right? And so then you don't take your problems to them and you don't go to them and say, here's an issue we're having. We're having a hard time, with new sponsors this year, or we're having a hard time getting into this segment of the community. Letting them know your problems is offering them an opportunity to help. And so I think sometimes we get so closed off of wanting to project this image when that's not allowing the volunteers in to the work.
Right. And I would say if I look back over the last 15 years of being a leadership volunteer for the American Cancer Society before I became staff, some of the times I felt the most impactful to the American Cancer Society were those tough times, where I was brought in on a problem that we needed to solve, for anything from reorganizations to, event level challenges with sponsorship to, the COVID-19 pandemic. Like those are the times where I felt
that small problem,
just a small thing, just a small problem. Were the times where I felt like I was able to really give back in the biggest possible way. So I think you're 100% right. The trust is so key, and it's trust from the get-go. It's not necessarily wait until you've built that trust. It's trust but verify when you're building those volunteer leaders.
Absolutely. Well, Bryan, if there are people listening who are thinking, this sounds like a great volunteer opportunity, I always have wanted to get more involved with the American Cancer Society, where can we send them? We'll put some information in our show notes.
Yes. So for Relay for Life, you can always visit us at relayforlife.org. We're also on Instagram at Relay for Life. For our general American Cancer Society, all of our community fundraising events, and even our non-fundraising volunteer roles, you can visit us at cancer.org.
Awesome. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for jumping in on this topic. I think we could have I think we kept ourselves concise. I think we could have talked about this for a very, very, very long time. But thank you so much for joining us today and for all of your great work.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcy, for having me.
The P2P Soap Box is produced in partnership with True Story FM. Engineering by Pete Wright. Music this week is by Manners. If your podcast app allows ratings and reviews, we hope you'll consider doing just that for our show. But the best thing that you can do to support the P2P Soap Box is simply to share the show with a friend or colleague. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next season.